He had seen every kind of performance imaginable, but when this man walked onto the stage carrying nothing but his voice and 20 years of silence that had somehow transformed into the purest form of musical communication, Simon Cowell realized he was about to witness something that would redefine what it means to lead without words. The America's Got Talent theater hummed with familiar energy, but tonight there was an undercurrent of musical anticipation mixed with profound curiosity, as if the audience sensed they were about to experience something that challenged their understanding of communication and the relationship between silence and musical expression. His name was Marcus Rivera, 39 years old, walking confidently toward center stage despite carrying selective mutism that had stolen his ability to speak socially 20 years ago. But this silence had somehow transformed into extraordinary musical communication that transcended normal human capability. Marcus had developed selective mutism at 19, following trauma that severed his connection to verbal language in social situations. While he could speak when completely alone, the presence of others triggered involuntary silence. But Marcus had discovered something remarkable. His inability to speak had somehow enhanced his musical perception and vocal abilities to unprecedented levels. Marcus represents one of the most fascinating cases of selective mutism we've encountered. Dr. Sarah Chen, his psychologist, had explained to colleagues, his condition doesn't affect his vocal cords. It's a psychological barrier that prevents speech socially. But remarkably, this has enhanced his musical processing capabilities in unprecedented ways. The discovery occurred 6 years into his silence during therapy when Dr. Chen was playing background music. Without warning, Marcus began humming along, but his vocalization wasn't simple mimicry. It was harmonic improvisation, demonstrating perfect pitch and complex musical understanding that professional musicians spent years learning. When Marcus vocalizes musically, his mutism completely disappears. Dr. Chen had noted, he can produce incredibly complex vocal arrangements, demonstrate perfect pitch across multiple octaves, and even communicate specific meanings through purely musical expression. It's as if his inability to speak conversationally has unlocked musical communication abilities that exceed normal human capability. Marcus had begun experimenting with vocal conducting, using only humming, tonal variations, and melodic patterns to direct musical performances. He discovered that his enhanced musical perception allowed him to guide other musicians through purely vocal cues that transcended verbal instruction. Marcus's vocal conducting is unlike anything we've seen in traditional musical education, observed Dr. Robert Kim, a musicologist. He can communicate tempo changes, dynamic variations, harmonic progressions, and emotional interpretations through purely tonal expression. Musicians report that following his vocal cues feels more intuitive and emotionally connected than traditional conducting methods. Marcus had initially been reluctant to share his abilities publicly, worried people would see his condition as novelty, rather than understanding the profound communication possible through purely vocal musical expression. But as music professionals began recognizing the sophistication of his vocal conducting, Marcus understood that his selective mutism had not limited communication. It had revealed forms of expression that verbal language could never achieve. I discovered that my silence wasn't empty, it was full of music that was waiting to be shared, Marcus had explained through written communication. When I can't speak words, my voice finds other ways to express everything I'm thinking and feeling. Marcus's vocal conducting had begun attracting attention from both psychological and musical communities. Therapists were amazed by his demonstration that communication disorders could enhance, rather than diminish, expressive capability, while musicians were fascinated by the emotional directness of his purely vocal leadership style. But Marcus's most remarkable discovery was that his vocal conducting seemed to enhance the musical abilities of the people he worked with. Musicians who performed under his guidance reported achieving levels of ensemble coordination and musical sensitivity that exceeded their normal capabilities. When Marcus conducts our rehearsals, something extraordinary happens, explained violinist Jennifer Martinez. His vocal cues seem to connect us not just rhythmically but emotionally. We play as one instrument with a level of musical unity that verbal conducting rarely achieves. It's as if his silence has taught us to listen more deeply to each other. Standing backstage at AGT, Marcus felt the familiar calm that came from knowing his voice would soon transform social silence into musical communication that transcended verbal limitations. Tonight, he would demonstrate that the absence of verbal communication could reveal forms of musical expression and leadership that words could never achieve. The audience's reaction was immediate curiosity mixed with respectful attention. Here was someone whose bearing suggested extraordinary musical authority, despite obvious communication challenges. Simon said gently, "Hello," recognizing that conventional conversation might not be possible. Marcus nodded with quiet dignity, then handed Simon a written card. "My name is Marcus Rivera. I have selective mutism and cannot speak in social situations, but I can communicate through music in ways that words never could. Tonight, I want to show you that silence can become the foundation for the purest form of musical leadership." Simon read the card aloud, and immediately the theater's energy shifted to one of profound respect and anticipation. Marcus positioned himself at center stage and stood in complete silence, allowing the audience to experience the space that existed before musical communication began. Then, without verbal introduction, Marcus began to vocalize, not conventional singing, but producing tonal patterns that seemed to emerge directly from his enhanced musical perception. What followed was unlike anything the AGT audience had experienced. Marcus's vocalizations began as simple harmonic progressions, but quickly evolved into complex melodic patterns that seemed to communicate specific musical instructions, emotional interpretations, and rhythmic guidance that professional musicians would normally express through detailed verbal direction. "Marcus is demonstrating vocal conducting," Simon explained to the audience. "He's showing us how musical leadership can exist without words." Marcus's vocal conducting continued to develop, incorporating tempo changes, dynamic variations, and harmonic progressions that demonstrated sophisticated musical understanding. His vocalizations weren't random musical expression, they were precise, intentional communication that conveyed complex musical information through purely tonal means. To demonstrate the practical application of his vocal conducting, Marcus had arranged for a small ensemble of musicians to join him on stage. Without any verbal communication or traditional conducting gestures, Marcus began guiding the ensemble through a classical piece, using only his enhanced vocal abilities. The effect was immediate and profound. The musicians responded to Marcus's vocal cues with a level of precision and emotional connection that exceeded normal ensemble performance. His humming, tonal variations, and melodic guidance created musical communication that seemed to bypass intellectual processing to access direct musical intuition. "What you're witnessing," Simon explained, "is musical communication that exists beyond verbal language." Marcus is conducting this entire ensemble through vocal expression that his selective mutism has somehow enhanced to extraordinary levels. As Marcus's vocal conducting continued, it became clear that his communication transcended typical musical direction to become something closer to musical telepathy. The ensemble moved as one instrument, responding to Marcus's vocal guidance with spontaneous musical decisions that created performance quality that verbal instruction rarely achieved. Marcus's final demonstration involved conducting the ensemble through an improvised piece that had no written score, guiding the musicians through purely vocal communication that created complex harmonic relationships, rhythmic patterns, and emotional expressions in real time. When Marcus completed his vocal conducting demonstration, the theater remained in profound silence for several moments as the audience processed not just the musical beauty they had witnessed, but the revelation that communication disorders could enhance rather than diminish artistic capability. Then applause began, not the usual entertainment appreciation, but the kind of recognition that follows genuine artistic revelation, acknowledgement of having witnessed something that expanded understanding of human potential and communication possibilities. Simon stood up from the judges' table, understanding that Marcus had demonstrated something far more significant than musical talent. He had proven that communication disorders could become sources of artistic innovation, that the absence of verbal language could reveal hidden forms of expression and leadership. "Marcus," Simon said, knowing that Marcus couldn't respond verbally, but trusting that his message would be understood, "what you've just shared challenges everything I thought I knew about communication, leadership, and musical expression. You haven't just overcome a communication disorder," Simon continued. "You've shown us that your selective mutism has given you musical abilities that transcend normal human capability. You've demonstrated that sometimes the most powerful leadership comes not from speaking, but from finding alternative forms of communication that connect directly with people's musical and emotional intuition." Marcus nodded with quiet satisfaction and produced another written card that read, "I learned that my silence wasn't a barrier to communication. It was a doorway to forms of musical expression that verbal language could never achieve. When words are impossible, music becomes the purest form of human connection." As the golden buzzer activated and confetti fell, Simon said, "Marcus, you've proven that the most profound communication sometimes emerges from the places where conventional language cannot go, and that silence can become the foundation for the most extraordinary forms of musical leadership." After the cameras stopped rolling, Marcus spent time with audience members and musicians who approached him, communicating through written notes and musical demonstration about his techniques for vocal conducting and the ways that selective mutism could reveal hidden musical capabilities. He provided information about communication disorders and resources for people seeking to understand alternative forms of expression. 6 months later, Marcus established the Silent Music Institute, teaching musicians and conductors to explore the communicative possibilities that existed within purely vocal musical expression. His techniques proved valuable not just for people with communication disorders, but for any musicians seeking to develop deeper, more intuitive forms of ensemble communication. Marcus's work attracted attention from both psychological and musical communities. Music schools began incorporating his vocal conducting techniques into curricula about nonverbal communication and musical leadership, while therapy programs explored the implications of his demonstration that communication disorders could enhance rather than diminish expressive capability. Marcus revolutionized how we think about selective mutism and musical communication, explained Dr. Chen. He proved that communication disorders could reveal alternative forms of expression that were more powerful than conventional verbal language, opening entirely new approaches to musical education and therapy. The Institute developed programs for people with various communication challenges, helping them discover that their verbal limitations could become sources of unique musical gifts rather than just social obstacles to overcome. Marcus's most innovative program worked with autistic individuals and others with communication differences, teaching them to use musical expression as a bridge to social connection when verbal communication felt impossible or inadequate. Years later, Marcus's vocal conducting abilities had evolved into increasingly sophisticated forms, suggesting that his selective mutism continued to enhance his musical capabilities as his understanding of nonverbal communication deepened. Marcus proved that the intersection of communication disorders and musical expression could produce forms of leadership that transcended both verbal limitation and conventional musical instruction, Dr. Wong observed. His work opened entirely new territories for understanding the communicative potential that could emerge from silence. Marcus continued developing his vocal conducting practice while also training musicians and therapists to recognize the musical dimensions that existed within various forms of communication differences. His greatest satisfaction came from helping people understand that the absence of verbal language could become a source of musical gifts that enhanced rather than limited communicative possibility. The silent conductor who found voice in pure music had demonstrated that selective mutism could enhance rather than diminish leadership capability, that the absence of verbal communication could reveal hidden musical dimensions of human expression, and that the most powerful forms of connection might emerge from the intersection of silence and the courage to find new ways to share the music that existed within every human heart. The AGT episode featuring Marcus became a phenomenon in both psychological and musical communities, generating unprecedented interest in the relationship between communication disorders and artistic expression. Selective mutism support groups worldwide reported increased hope among members who had previously viewed their condition as purely limiting. Marcus fundamentally changed how we understand the relationship between selective mutism and human potential, explained Dr. Chen during a conference on communication disorders. He proved that communication disorders could enhance rather than simply diminish capability when approached with creativity and musical understanding. The Silent Musics Institute expanded internationally, with programs in 12 countries adapted to different cultural contexts while maintaining core principles of nonverbal musical communication. Marcus's vocal conducting techniques were studied by conservatories worldwide and translated into multiple musical traditions. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, a conductor with the Vienna Philharmonic, began incorporating Marcus's methods with professional orchestras. When we eliminated verbal instruction and focused purely on vocal cues, our ensemble achieved levels of musical unity that traditional conducting rarely produces, he reported. Musicians described feeling more connected to each other and to the emotional content of the music. The Institute developed specialized programs for different communication challenges. Children with autism learned to use musical expression as bridges to social connection, while adults with social anxiety discovered that musical communication could bypass verbal barriers that made normal conversation difficult. 3 years after AGT, Marcus's work attracted attention from neuroscientists studying the relationship between language processing and musical ability. Advanced brain imaging revealed that Marcus's enhanced musical capabilities involved neural networks and connectivity patterns that remained underdeveloped in most verbally fluent individuals. Marcus's brain shows extraordinary connectivity between auditory processing and motor coordination centers, explained neuroscientist Dr. Patricia Kim. His selective mutism appears to have redirected neural resources toward musical processing, creating capabilities that exceed normal human musical perception and communication. Marcus's influence extended beyond therapy into professional music education, where conservatories began incorporating nonverbal conducting techniques into training programs for future musical leaders. Marcus proved that musical leadership doesn't require verbal articulation, observed conducting professor Dr. Sarah Martinez. His techniques help conductors access more intuitive, more emotionally direct forms of musical communication. 5 years after his AGT appearance, Marcus published Voice Without Words, which became essential reading for music educators, therapists, and anyone interested in alternative forms of communication. The book included detailed analysis of vocal conducting techniques alongside scientific explanations of the neurological differences that made them possible. Marcus's most innovative development was creating silent orchestras, ensembles that performed entirely through nonverbal musical communication, demonstrating that complex musical performances could be achieved without any spoken instruction or verbal coordination. Marcus's silent orchestras show us that musical communication can be more direct and emotionally powerful than verbal instruction, observed music therapist Dr. Lisa Wong. His methods create musical experiences that feel more connected and intuitive than traditional conducting approaches. The man who transformed silence into musical leadership had created a global movement toward understanding communication disorders as sources of artistic enhancement rather than just social limitations, proving that the most profound forms of musical expression might emerge when verbal barriers force the discovery of entirely new forms of human connection and artistic communication.